Hi everyone. So today we're gonna continue our exploration of the book Hyperobjects by Timothy Morton. My last video was about the introduction of the book. We went through the introduction, and we ended up with talking about the structure of the book. There are two parts. The first part is what are hyperobjects, and that's going to be the subject of this video. So just to warn you, there are a lot of references to physics in this book, particularly quantum mechanics, and since I'm not qualified to talk about those, most of the parts that deal with quantum physics, most of the parts I'm going to have to leave them out. I will just talk about the parts where I'm more or less confident that I got it right, but if I'm wrong and you are an expert on quantum mechanics, well, you can correct me in the comments. So the first part of the book, what are hyperobjects, Morton has an epigraph from a poem by the English poet Percy B. Shelley, and the epigraph reads, "That awful shadow of an unseen power." Now that line comes from a poem by Percy B. Shelley, Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, in which the narrator kind of contemplates some sort of scenery and refers to it as the shadow of an unseen power, which is beauty. And so in the poem, beauty is like a hyperobject. It is unseen, but you can see its shadows, right? Like you can only see its effects. And just to clarify, awful does not mean bad here, all right? The awful shadow doesn't mean bad. It actually means being full of awe. So an awful shadow means a sublime shadow. Okay. So in romantic philosophy, the sublime is the kind of feeling you get when, for example, you look at a landscape and you suddenly get the feeling that you're about to die. Like the landscape is so huge and you are so small by comparison, and so you kind of feel very vulnerable being out there in the open, and it's like, you know, nature can crush you or swallow you whole at any moment. So and even if you don't have like nature, if you don't have a landscape, you can still experience the sublime by standing there, for example, when you stand on a huge bridge during, for example, a winter day, and you see a giant river like miles down, and it is running toward the ocean, which you can see right there, right in front of you, and the weather is a bit foggy. You have this white, huge fog covering the ocean, and in the fog you feel like, you know, there's something enormous right there, like something gigantic watching you, like Cthulhu, you know, the monster from H.P. Lovecraft's fiction. And so all you see is maybe a blurred silhouette that moves like a very far fading mountain. Maybe you meet the eyes of this creature, but what is sure is that you are not going to see the creature. Okay, you're not going to see Cthulhu hiding in there in the fog, and so there is always something that is going to be covering the monster. Like he's definitely there, he is in the fog, he's close and very, very close to you, and you stand there on that bridge and you can just hear this tiny voice in your head saying, "Jump!" You know? And well, that's the feeling that you get when you are interacting with a hyperobject. And so global warming is basically like Cthulhu. Okay, it's right there, it's on Earth, it's closer than you think, and it is kind of calling you to jump from the bridge. And so the first characteristic of a hyperobject is viscosity. Remember we said last time that hyperobjects have 5 characteristics: viscosity, non-locality, temporal undulation, phasing, and interobjectivity. And so the first one is viscosity. Now, this means that hyperobjects are viscous, like they snatch onto you. They're literally on you. You know, they're glued to you, and they don't let you go. All right, just like Cthulhu, once it has its grip on you, then that's it. You know, you can never shake them off. And so Morton mentions an imagery from another poem by another poet, William Wordsworth, and you know, the imagery kind of looks like what I just described, only instead of Cthulhu, it's a mountain. To quote from Morton, it's like the episode in Wordsworth's autobiographical poem, The Prelude, in which the boy Wordsworth steals a boat. As he rows away from the mountain, it seems for a while to loom ever larger in his field of vision, as if it were pursuing him due to a strange parallax effect in which more of a suitably massive object is revealed as one goes farther away from it. This event is surely a good example of what the previous section calls viscosity. It is as if the mountain is stuck to Wordsworth, as if it won't let him go. So basically, you cannot get rid of hyperobjects. The more you try to distance yourself from hyperobjects, the more persistent they become. To quote again, all objects are caught in the sticky goo of viscosity because they never ontologically exhaust one another, even when they smack headlong into one another. A good example of viscosity would be radioactive materials. The more you try to get rid of them, the more you realize you can get rid of them. And so radioactive stuff indeed is a very good example of this because I mean, yeah, what are you going to do once you have it? I mean, once you have a radioactive object, I mean, you cannot throw them anywhere, right? You can just keep it somewhere where its radioactivity doesn't spread. But I mean, now it's kind of it's part of our world now. If you dump it somewhere, it's going to snatch itself onto the materials around it, and the radioactivity is going to spread. So you have this deadly thing now, and you cannot distance yourself from it. And this can be very disturbing because it means that there is no distance between you and hyperobjects. Quote, I do not access hyperobjects across a distance through some transparent medium. Hyperobjects are here, right here in my social and experiential space. Like faces pressed against a window, they leer at me menacingly. Their very nearness is what menaces. And so basically it's like Cthulhu is watching you, you know, Big Brother maybe is watching you. Big Brother in that sense is a hyperobject. Or you can think of ghosts, for example. They're always looking at you, right? And so global warming is basically like that. It is a ghost. You know, in movies where a character feels touched, for example, by something, and they look around, and and they find no one there. Like, you know, ghosts always have to be like 10-year-old jerks pulling pranks, like, you know, they ring your bell and then they run away. Well, hyperobjects are like that. They are ghosts of 10-year-old jerks, you know, 10-year-old pranksters. Quote, everyday global warming burns the skin on the back of my neck, making me itch with physical discomfort and inner anxiety. And so more seriously, what this tells us is that we have some sort of defense mechanism against ghosts, but those mechanisms are inefficient. You know, like distance is a defense mechanism against hyperobject. We think we can hold global warming away like it's something, you know, that is way too far from us, way too far to hurt us or to affect us. Like we built walls in order to protect ourselves from wild animals, from harsh weather, from robbers, but when it comes to ghosts, well, they can just fly right through the wall. You know, there is no way to keep them away. And so the human world type of relationship, remember the correlationist the correlationist view that we talked about last time, where you have a human that looks at a world, and so this type of relationship, doesn't really work anymore. Like humans need to look at the world from a distance in order to control it, but the world is a ghost now. Okay, there is no distance between you and your laptop, for example, or between you and your chair, your desk, the air that you breathe, and all of that comes crushing down on you. To quote again the book, distance is only a psychic and ideological construct designed to protect me from the nearness of things. And so global warming is kind of breaking down our notion of distance between things, like the food that we eat, they cause global warming, the car that we drive, the clothes that we wear, the roads that we build, the books that we read, etc. All of those things are now global warming, all right? And so by being global warming, all the objects that we use, all the objects with which we interact every day, they take this new aura of uncanniness, right? As he says, I do not feel at home in the biosphere. And so in short, it is everywhere. Hyperobjects, global warming is everywhere, and nothing can keep it at bay. Quote, the more I know about global warming, the more I realize how pervasive it is. They are all over me. It's the objects and the hyperobjects. They are me. I feel like Neo in the Matrix, lifting to his face in horrified wonder his head, coated in the mirror-like substance into which the doorknob has dissolved, and his virtual body begins to disintegrate. The mirror itself has become part of my flesh, or rather, I have become part of the mirror's flesh, reflecting hyperobjects everywhere. And so, hyperobjects, they snatch onto you, and by doing that, they alter your being. They alter your being, your very own body, quite literally. They are, in the philosophical sense of the word, demonic. Okay, quote, hyperobjects are agents, and they are demonic in that through them causalities flow like electricity. And so here Morton goes back to the very origins of the word demonic. It comes from daimon, which in ancient Greek means some sort of guiding spirit that literally gets inside you and inspires you. It is a daimon that takes possession of a poet or a rhapsode and alters their state of mind, and that's how you'd produce a poem. This is the view in ancient Greece, for example. Daimons put you in some sort of frenzy, like some sort of mania, which means that you are no longer in control of yourself. The daimon is speaking through you or moving through you like when you are in a rave dance, for example. When you go to the club and see high people dancing in some sort of uncontrollable way, that looks like the dance rituals that occur in ancient Greek religions, where the dancers were believed to be possessed by actual daimons. And so, just to clarify, a daimon in Greek religion doesn't mean an evil spirit, but a divine one. Okay, it can be an actual god, or it can be a muse, or the spirit of a hero, or even the spirit of another great poet. Like, for example, when Ion was a rhapsode in ancient Greece, and he talked with Socrates. When he does that, Ion is known for reciting Homer, and when he recites Homer, he's literally being possessed by the spirit of Homer. And when Socrates lays some truth lay some truth, on his interlocutors. He often says that he has no idea where, that truth came from, and it must have been the work of a daimon. He even says at some point that he can converse with his own daimon. And so hyperobjects are kind of like that. Okay, so global warming is a daimon, and it gets beneath your skin and it makes you do some stuff. like we'll talk about this more when we talk about Morton's view on the artists who are possessed, let's say, by hyperobjects. So this will come mostly in the next video. Sorry, in the third video, but you can experience this with, for example, regular music. The regular music you listen to. When you listen to music, we often take it as you attune yourself to the music, right? I mean, there's melody and there's rhythm, and so you dance in a synchronized way with the rhythm and the music. That's basically attunement. But in the case of hyperobjects, you don't attune to the music. It's actually the other way around. The music attunes to you. As he says, the music tunes to me, pursuing my innards, searching out the resonant frequencies of my stomach, my intestines, the pockets of gristle in my face. And so that's basically when you feel the beat, all right? Like he gives an example. The walls of feedback that the Velvet Underground inaugurated in Heroin are sound as hyperobject, a sound from which I cannot escape, a viscous sonic latex. It hurts me, a strange masochist dimension of aesthetic experience opens up underneath the one in which the art object and I appear to be held in a perfect conscient mind meld. So basically you lose all sense of self, just like with the mania. You are taken away by the music and you just dissolve like Neo with the mirror. Because in that state, quote, when the inside of a thing coincides perfectly with the outside, that's called dissolution or death. And so Morton draws on Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of the viscous. It is often translated as sliminess, but in French it's le visqueux. And Sartre gives the example of when you put your hand in a jar of jam and you feel the jam sticking in there. Or when you touch anything that is slimy, for example, you're always disgusted or something, like you don't want to touch slimy things because, as Sartre explains towards the end of his book, Being and Nothingness, a slime is kind of like you, but it also is not like you. Like a slime is kind of in a two states at the same time. It is both solid and liquid at the same time, and you are disgusted by that. You look at the slime and you're like, come on, pick a side. I mean, you're either solid or liquid. You cannot be both at once. And in those moments, Sartre describes the sliminess like a moment in which both the thing in itself and the thing for itself absorb each other. The essence and the appearance, well, they just collide with each other, they fuse with each other, and that causes the two to dissolve in each other. Both appearance and essence, they both collapse. So if you vibe with the music, then you are basically dying. And that's a good thing, at least for Morton, because, well, if we don't die, then there would be nothing. There would be no time, actually. And I think this is something true now about the nature of time in physics. Like, now we don't consider time to be a continuum in which we are present, but rather we, objects, create time. Like, time is emanating from all beings who, I quote, exist in the jaws of some form of death. And later on he says that viscosity is a feature of the way in which time emanates from objects rather than being a continuum in which they float. So I understand this as when objects are formed, let's say, they emanate time. okay, which can be understood as viscosity, which objects will go on and snatch onto other objects, creating different combinations with others. But that ability to snatch themselves or glue themselves to other things, I mean, that stems from their entropy. That they're destined to dissolve once they had a perfect grab onto something else. Like when the music glues itself to you, it's like a perfect match. And so you and the music, I guess, you both die, and then whatever results from that fusion, from that dissolution, whenever resulted from that, is going to emanate more time, so it will go glue itself to something else, and so on and so forth. So basically, Neo looks at his hand and, to quote Morton, the mirror has ceased to be merely a reflective surface. It has become a viscous substance that adheres to his hand. Like the viscosity breaks the mirror, since the mirror sends back a reflection of something standing in front of it, so it didn't absorb it yet, let's say, or blended with it, but once it does, once it adheres to his hand, once it harmonizes itself with it, like the music does to you, well, then there is no Neo anymore, right? Like the mirror/hand, it's no longer reflecting anything. Quote, it's not reality, but the subject that dissolves the very capacity to mirror things, to be separate from the world, like someone looking at a reflection in a mirror. And so, in such state, where there is no reflection anymore, Morton says that we have reached sincerity or ingenuousness. Quote, hyperobjects push the reset button on sincerity, just as Neo discovers that the mirror no longer distances from his image from him in a nice, aesthetically manageable way, but sticks to him. And this has some serious implications for our societies at large, because, well, when hyperobjects snatch themselves to us, it means that now we have to deal with them in ways that we don't really know how. There is no manual to how to solve global warming, so we have radioactive stuff kind of laying around everywhere, and it is snatching itself to us. It found itself a home here, and the distance is basically growing thinner each day, and, well, here we are, still trying to do the same old rational tactics that got us into this mess in the first place. So we are trying to build on some distance between us and radioactive stuff, between us and global warming, and it is already affecting the nature even of democratic societies. To quote Morton, the more we fight phenomenological sincerity with our reason, the more glued we figure out we are, which is what it feels like to live in risk society, a society in which growing scientific awareness of risk from toxic chemicals, for instance, changes the nature of democracy itself. Now, using the same tactics as before, obviously that won't help us, because, as Morton concludes, the fact that there is no meta-language does not mean that we are forever floating in outer space, but quite the opposite. We are glued to our phenomenological situation. So we will go back to this, to what he means by a meta-language and what he means by there is no meta-language. But for now, that's basically the first characteristic of a hyperobject, right? That's it for viscosity. Now, the second characteristic is non-locality. And so non-locality is a technical term in quantum physics, and as I said, I'm not really qualified to talk about physics, but here it's kind of a big part of it, so I'll try to do my best to explain it from what I understood from the book. And so what I think it means is that with quantum physics, you can entangle particles. This means that you can, quote, send one particle some information, make it spin a certain way, and the others will instantly spin in a complementary ways. So it's like in those movies where you have twins who feel like who feel, you know, what the other is feeling, like a twin feels what the other twin is feeling, and they're like miles away from each other. And so apparently quantum physics can do that, and Morton mentions some experiments that confirm it. But we're left with a paradox here, that if this theory is true, then we have to say that some information travels faster than light, which is supposed to be impossible. And Morton says that, well, the speed of light cannot be violated. I mean, you cannot travel faster than light. So the problem must be that the problem must be in reality itself. And that is, to quote, unless you want to believe that the speed of light can be violated, a notion that gives physicists the jitters, you might have to accept that reality just is non-local. And so he goes into what it means for reality to be non-local. I'm just going to, I'm not going to dive too deep with the physics. I'll talk about it when I feel confident that I got it. But anyways, for now, reality is basically non-local. What affects a particle here can affect another particle there. And for now, we're gonna go with shut up, it's magic. Okay, so global warming works like that, and that can be a problem because it basically states that you cannot pin down a specific location for global warming. Like, you cannot say that it is happening there in California, despite everyone, you know, turning to solar panel to like, you know, use a, like when you discover that summers are getting hotter every year and you have more frequent forest fires, drought and storms, global warming is you know, global warming is just not there, you know. And so this can be a problem, because how can you convince someone that a threat is real when the threat is not local, you know, that it's not there, you know? And so you have to rely on other means than just point out somewhere and say, look, there's global warming. It's just right there, you know, it's in California. Look, everyone is turning to solar panels. Summers are getting hotter. And even more challenging, how can you prove that the rising temperatures, the droughts, the storms, etc., are caused by global warming? If you cannot point to global warming, then you cannot say that you cannot say that whatever phenomenon that we are experiencing is caused by global warming or is proof that global warming is real. So we have to rely on less convincing means to point to global warming. To quote Morton, hyperobjects seem to inhabit a Humean causal system in which association, correlation, and probability are the only things we have to go on for now. That's why it's so easy for big tobacco and global warming deniers. Of course, there is no direct proof of a causal link. However, Morton tells us that there is a way around this. You see, when you cannot prove that phenomenon X is caused by global warming, it doesn't mean that you have to abandon objective causality, you know, and we have to embrace, you know, a subjective one, like we just make the links up. One of the misconceptions that we have about causality is that if you cannot prove that X is caused by Y, then you are not objective. Okay, you're just making some bullshit cause. And so for you, that would be global warming. For someone who believes in global warming, well, the cause is global warming because of some sort of upbringing or because of some brainwashing or whatever, but it's not objective. I mean, this is how the deniers reason about it. So since it is all subjective, well, I'm not entitled to listen to you. And so this kind of reasoning can be misleading because Morton isn't saying that at all. He's not favoring some subjective causality, like we go ahead and make some shit up to explain things, over objective causality. What he says is, quote, post-Humean causality is by no means a matter of objective versus subjective impressions, let alone a matter of human reality versus non-human reality. Rather, it is a matter of different levels of causality. And so the different level is one of what Morton calls aesthetic causality, which is also objective causality. It's just that it is on another level. It's another level of causality. And so he says, what we are dealing with here are aesthetic effects that are directly causal. The octopus of the hyperobject emits a cloud of ink as it withdraws from axis. Yet this cloud of ink is a cloud of effects and affects. Now, sure, if you don't see the octopus spitting its ink, technically you cannot really prove that the ink was caused by an octopus, right? You just found the ink, but the octopus wasn't there. And so what do? Well, you can do the classic science stuff and pull an Occam razor, like you go for the most probable and simplest theory to explain why there is ink in the ocean. Like the theory that says it was an octopus that left the ocean before we arrive seems more plausible than whatever other theory you can come up with to explain the presence of the ink. And so the theory of global warming should be the best candidate, since it kind of explains how CO2 levels are rising in the atmosphere. Then the denier's theory of climate always changes, for example, and it's just brainwashing propaganda, you know. And if we have the non-local feature, then it can explain why there is rising temperature but no global warming to be seen. If we apply object-oriented ontology, for example, to global warming, which we explained in the last video, then we have something that explains best how global warming works, and that aligned with the best scientific theories of our days. To quote Morton, object-oriented ontology is deeply congruent with the most profound, accurate, and testable theory of physical reality available. Actually, it would be better to say it the other way around. Quantum theory works because it's object-oriented. And just like in quantum mechanics, you can't try to understand global warming using the ways of thinking from classical mechanics, where you think that the world can be divided into different parts that are separate and distinct from each other, but interact in some sort of harmonious whole. This, according to Morton, I mean, it cannot help us to understand global warming because of its non-locality. What is happening in California, for example, is not part of global warming. If it were, then global warming would have a locality. We just need to figure out the places in which global warming is happening, and that way we will know where global warming is. But in object-oriented ontology, as well as quantum physics, you cannot separate the part from the whole because, quote, you are not part of a larger whole. Everything is unfolded in everything as flowing movement. Think about, for example, the city of London. Morton gives the city of London as an example of hyperobject. Now, London, he says, is not a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts. Nor is London reducible to those parts. London cannot be undermined downward or upward. He means that London is a flowing movement through its people, its birds, its pigeons, its transportations, geopolitical relations, through tourists. Each thing in London is more than just itself. You know, it is London and more. And likewise, London cannot be reduced to its part, nor it is greater than the sum of its part. You know, it's just something else, something in which everything exists or coexists. And so everything is in London, and London is in everything. And if everything is in everything, whether something withdraws from the rest, then whenever something withdraws from the rest, then it is everything that withdraws from everything. Quote, particles withdraw from one another, not because humans are observing them in certain ways, but because the implicate order is withdrawn from itself. So the order itself is withdrawn from itself. So it cannot have a locality. I mean, it's okay if you are confused. I myself, I'm not sure that I got it right. But the next quote sure can help us understand what he means by all of this. And this is a quote from Bohm, a leading scientist in quantum physics. And so Morton quotes him and says, quantum theory requires us to give up the idea that the electron or any other object has by itself any intrinsic properties at all. Instead, each object should be regarded as something containing only incompletely defined potentialities that are developed when an object interacts with an appropriate system. And so what I think this means is that non-locality makes it so that we have to abandon the idea of determinism in the sense that some particles will always have some essential properties that will make it become what is destined to become, right? So, I mean, this is kind of a metaphor, I think, like a bud, for example, has by itself the intrinsic property of becoming a tree. I'm not saying that with quantum theory a bud can become a fish, for example, but I mean this is applied to small quantum particles, okay? So what I said about the bud, that's just a metaphor. So instead of saying that we know that a bud will beget a tree or will turn into a tree, it would be more accurate to say we don't know what the bud is going to beget, what the bud is going to turn into. And so its possibilities, the everything that is within it, are withdrawn. And so this withdrawn everything, this withdrawn order that we don't know what, when, and where is going to reveal something, this is non-locality. It implies that the notion of being located at all is only epiphenomenal to a deeper atemporal implicate order. So global warming can be literally everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It is both affecting us and affecting everything around us, and we can only have some sort of access to it through hardcore computing, and we can only see local manifestations of something that is non-local. As he says, heavy rain is simply a local manifestation of some vast entity that I am unable directly to see. Thus, the right-wing talking heads are quite correct to be afraid of global warming. It means something ontologically scary about our world. It means that not only is everything interconnected, a fatal blow to individualists everywhere, the well it is snowing in Bo's Idaho, or so global warming is a crock, meme is a desperate attempt to put this ontological genie back in its bottle. And so trying to catch global warming in the ecological catastrophes is like trying to catch the unconscious, for example. It isn't something that occupies some space, but is distributed through space and time. Morton compares global warming to the Hiroshima bomb, for example, referring to a book about a series of witnesses about the bomb. Quote, each witness gives a unique account of the bomb. No single witness experiences the bomb entirely. Now, yeah, of course, the witnesses didn't see the bomb. I mean, if you were close enough to see the bomb, you'd be dead. But the witnesses convey an experience of hyperobjects. So that's non-locality. Hyperobjects leave their traces on us, but we cannot see where they are. We are inside them as well as they, through their traces, traces in us. All right, they are inside us as well through their traces, and we are inside hyperobjects. From everywhere, hyperobjects therefore affect our bodies, and they even rewrite our DNA. And so this leads Morton to write what I think is one of the most beautiful passages in the book. In a sense, we can expect human egos to be pockmarked with the traces of hyperobjects. We are all burnt by ultraviolet rays. We all contain water in about the same ratio as Earth does, and salt water in the same ratio that the ocean do. We are poems about the hyperobject Earth. Now, a side note, you can say, well, what about God? Isn't it also a hyperobject? Does that mean that God exists? Well, Morton has an answer to that. He says that, well, God isn't physical, right? I mean, hyperobjects, they are, and they're not transcendent beings. Okay, so no, hyperobjects aren't God, or God is not a hyperobject. And we also said that hyperobjects don't do causality like God does. All right, the causality in hyperobject is aesthetic, whereas in God it is more, to quote a scholastic causa sui, inhabiting a beyond. Okay, so that should answer the objection that, well, what about God? Is that a hyperobject too? Now, just like they cannot be located in space, so too hyperobjects have their own quirks about time. Hyperobjects can't really be located in time either. We can just say that they exist, and they have existed, and will continue to exist, and that's all we can do. You know, for how long or when did they start, however, that's another issue. To quote Morton, they are so massively distributed in time that they seem to taper off like a long street stretched into the distance. And so trying to figure out if global warming started, or when did it start, or when will it start, is like, in Morton's word, trying to get closer to the moon by running towards it, all the while forgetting that you are on the surface of the earth. And so it is impossible to pin down when global warming started. To go back to the key and your car engine, it probably started millions of years ago. Okay? And so what runs your engines? Well, it is liquefied dinosaur DNA. So that's basically what gas is. And so think about oil. Did global warming started when we extracted oil, or did it start millions of years ago when that oil was formed? And so, to quote Morton, oil is the result of some dark secret collusion between rocks and algae and the plankton millions and millions of years in the past. When you look at oil, you're looking at the past. Hyperobjects are time stretched to such a vast extent that they become almost impossible to hold in mind. And so this doesn't mean that hyperobjects are eternal. They do have a start and an end. We just cannot find them due to their large size. And so for Morton, that's even more fascinating and anxiety fueling than infinity. When something has large finitude, it's more difficult to grasp than infinity. Quote, I can think of infinity, but I cannot count up to the 100,000. I have written 100,000 words, it in fits and starts, but 100,000 years, it's unimaginably vast. And it's not because it stretches through thousands or millions of years in the past, but also because it does in the future too. And since hyperobjects are this big, they'll surely be around for a very long time. This means that whatever it is we're doing now is going to continue and is going to contribute to the longevity of something that will last thousands, if not millions, of years in the future. Now, this can be scary because, I mean, to realize that we can influence the future to such a degree, well, I mean, it is scary. You cannot avoid thinking about the future generations in these circumstances, right? To quote Morton, I am directly responsible for beings that are so far in the future, insofar as two things will be true simultaneously. No one then will meaningfully be related to me, and my smallest action now will affect that time in profound ways. And so here he mentions a scene from a movie by Ranim Bahrani, I think that's how it is pronounced. The movie is called Plastic Bag, it's from 2009, and the movie is about a plastic bag that wishes to talk to the woman carrying groceries inside in it, to tell her, if I could meet my maker, I would tell her just one thing: I wish that she had created me so that I could die.
But I was quickly trapped. I have no idea how long ago that was. Over time, I came to like these monsters. Isn't that one beautiful? Did my maker exist, or had I created her in my mind? Why were my moments of joy so brief? And yet, like a fool, I still have hope I will meet her again. And if I do, I will tell her just one thing. I wish you had created me so that I could die.
And so this makes Morton think that infinity isn't so bad when compared to very large finitude. Because at least, infinity has a good side. He says, forever makes you feel important. 100,000 years make you wonder whether you can imagine 100,000 anything. It seems rather abstract to imagine that a book is 100,000 words long. So you certainly can get that feeling when you look at old manuscripts, for example, being kept at a museum, or when you go visit some ruins of ancient words and you just stand there and you imagine that thousands of years ago people lived there. It almost feels impossible to fathom. Like this monument in front of you was part of a civilization that lived thousands of years in the past. That is mind-blowing somehow. And so this is what Morton calls the rift. This sensation that there is such a space between the thing and its appearance, like hyperobjects are around for thousands of years, but we just see their effects in the now, in today, in the present. So it's like, to stand in front of a monument is like throwing us back to some realization that this thing here, this monument that I am looking at, that I am discovering just now, has been standing there for this long. And so this can be very, very, very scary. It can be very anxious. It can make us very anxious. And so this is how we experience time. Quote, time blossoms from what I shall call the rift between the appearance and the essence of a thing. And yeah, it has something to do with physics, like this. This time we're going to talk about relativity, which apparently no one seems to really grasp what it means, or at least what are its implications. Because according to Morton, we're not really relativists, but we are still Newtonians, at least in our day-to-day lives. We don't think of time like a relativist would in physics. Quote, in our daily social and psychic practices, we are still Newtonians, still in awe of infinite space, and behind that in awe of the infinite God of infinite space. And so relativity, however, deals away with God and with infinite spaces, which are some mechanisms as well, like distance, defense mechanisms, just like distance. We talked about it earlier. When some things are hard for us to fathom, we just throw in, well, it's infinite, and so it's case closed. We can go on with our day. And so Morton says, no, that's not really how it works. If we think this way, we did not understand relativity, which I don't think I understand it either, but I'm trying. So Morton says that Einstein basically discovered a hyperobject with his theory of relativity, and that hyperobject is the indivisible word tubes. And so he says, by word tubes, relativity theory means to include the apprehendic aspect of an entity with its entative aspect. A word tube is a hyperobject that is word tubes stretch and snap our ideas of what an object is in the first place. So if this was clear for you, please tell me in the comments. What does he mean by word tubes? Because I don't really get it. But from what I think I understood from reading the rest of the chapter, he means that hyperobjects, they curb space and time, like they cause temporal undulations, which causes us to see things differently from what they really are. He says, like, large objects emit gravitational fields that bend light, giving rise to the redshift from distant stars that remain a mystery until Einstein proposed relativity theory. Space-time isn't an empty box, but rather an undulating force field that emanates from objects. So hyperobjects do the same, I guess. They distort objects, bend their appearance because of the undulation that emanates from the objects themselves. Well, I'm not sure at this point if this is what he meant. I kind of got lost in this chapter about undulation, to be honest, but I believe that the gist of it is that there is a time that is beyond any calculability or predictability, because the rift is so big, the rift between the essence and the appearance of something is so big that it is impossible to close it, because it's kind of beyond our capacities. Morton says we have no time to learn fully about hyperobjects, but we have to handle them anyways. This handling causes ripples upon ripples. Entities that are massively distributed in time exert downward causal pressure on short-lived entities. Now, I think this chapter is the most obscure for me. I mean, this characteristic of temporal undulation, but I think that he's saying that that the same thing we can say about space in non-locality, we basically can also apply it to time when it comes to hyperobject. Like, I don't know, I'm not sure. So I'm just going to jump to the next characteristic, which I find very simpler to understand, and that is the fourth characteristic, phasing. So phasing is actually pretty simple, and it kind of takes up the problem of time we've seen. Basically, the large rift between thing and appearance causes some sort of out of sync relation between beings, like there are literal rifts in the space-time continuum. Like every being has a need for some constancy or continuity over its existence, and if there are too many ruptures in that continuity, well, let's say that's how you lose your mind. I mean, think about whenever you know someone, and then one day they have a mental breakdown, and it feels like it's not the same person anymore, right? You got used to this person being maybe composed, cheerful, strong, or whatever, and then one day you find the complete opposite when they have their mental breakdown. And it wasn't even a gradual process, like it just suddenly happens. And it is usually highly charged in emotions, and so like you never suspected that from that person in particular. And so when hyperobjects do that to beings, you know, they just rip their continuity and replaces it with what Morton calls phases. To quote Morton, "My sense of being in a time and of inhabiting a place depends on forms of regularity. The periodic rhythm of day and night, the sun coming up. Only now I know that it doesn't really come up. It is now a common knowledge that the moon's phases are just the relationship between the Earth and the moon as they circumnavigate the sun. So just like a metal breakdown, you go through a phase. You know, there is no continuity of your being, but it just manifests itself in different ways depending on the relationships you hold with your environment. So no one really knows you, okay? Your being only shows up in phases, never all at once. And like we said previously, even you don't know yourself because you also appear to yourself in the same way, through phases. And so global warming is like that. We don't see it because it only appears in phases. It comes and goes, you know. And so hyperobjects seem to phase in and out of the human world. Hyperobjects are phased. They occupy a high-dimensional phase space that makes them impossible to see as a whole on a regular three-dimensional human-scale basis. We can only see pieces of hyperobjects at a time. Trying to see them in more than just phases is like people from a two-dimensional world looking at an apple from a three-dimensional world. You know, they won't be able to see the apple like we do, but only as dots and a succession of circle-like shapes. Okay, to quote Morton, if an apple were to invade a two-dimensional world, first the stick people would see some dots as the bottom of the apple touched their universe, then a rapid succession of shapes that would appear like an expanding and contracting circular blob, diminishing to a tiny circle, possibly a point, and disappearing. And so similarly, hyperobjects are from a higher dimension. Quote, "That's why we can't see global warming. You would have to occupy some high-dimensional space to see it unfolding explicitly." And so global warming can only be seen from us at least as just snapshots of what is actually a very complex plot of super complex set of algorithms executing themselves in a high-dimensional phase space. A high enough dimensional being could see global warming itself as a static object. What horrifyingly complex tentacles would such an entity have, this high-dimensional object we call global warming? So maybe a being from the same dimension as hyperobjects would look at them having, you know, a Cthulhu shape. You know, maybe they are Cthulhu creatures. But just because we can't see the hyperobject directly, it doesn't mean that we can't see them in any other way. And so Morton gives the example of a movie. Like, technically you don't see a movie, but a series of pictures that are passing rapidly in front of you, in front of your eyes, to give you the sensation of flow and continuity, as if you are watching an action, as if you are watching a movement. So you can only see phases of a movie, but we can arrange them in such a way that the movie can be seen. This is called process philosophy, which means that you see everything as a liquid in which images or phases melt in. Like our eyes too work in that way. They see bits of lights, they send bits of light to the brain, and the brain recreates the bits of info received to give us a coherent and fluid image. To quote Morton, Process philosophy helps us to visualize how high-dimensional entities execute. Thus, a slightly upgraded way of seeing hyperobjects would be the plot or graph. So, the plot is what makes the phases of a movie make sense in some way. A graph makes a different data correlate with make the different data correlate with each other, drawing links between things we thought to be unrelated, for example. And so we kind of need to rely on technology to see global warming, because our eyes can do that for us. So we have to go to things that can. You know, our eyes cannot see the movie. They can see the movie once the phases have been arranged in a certain way. If you try to see hyperobject in the way they originally emanate through ripples and rifts, well, Morton says, the trouble is that we cannot help but fail to see such high-dimensional entities when they are plotted in this way. Software sees them for us, then we see data of slices of that phase space rendered in some way to make it usable. So, softwares that do the calculating for us are crucial to see hyperobjects like global warming. Okay, I mean, we do the same in physics, right? We don't really see all the entities that we discover through physical and mathematical equations. We don't see a black hole, but we can see its effects. We can, translate its presence through mathematical equations. Well, entities like that that require softwares in order to be seen aren't just confined to physical entities, but also philosophical concepts as well. Hyperobjects are also concepts, and they require that we think philosophically in order to apprehend them. You have to come up with innovative ways to deal with entities that cannot be seen directly or move through phases. And so if we rely just on when we see them or can experience them directly, then we'll have to commit to a very weird worldview. That is, if global warming appears to us through phases, it means that there are periods where there is no global warming, as if global warming takes holidays or goes golfing on the weekends, as Morton says. So rather we experience hyperobjects, global warming, in terms of phases, but global warming is constantly here in our world, all right? Like a black hole. We don't see them every day, but they're always here and their effects as well. Quote, when it rains on my head, climate is raining, the biosphere is raining, but what I feel are raindrops and gaps between raindrops. The gaps and ruptures are simply the invisible presence of the hyperobject itself, which looms around us constantly. So, yeah, I mean, if the thing moves in phases, there are going to be gaps, there are going to be periods in which we don't notice the hyperobject, but that doesn't mean that the hyperobject is not there anymore. So of course, we cannot also spend our time worrying about hyperobjects. We cannot spend our time never catching a break, because or else we'll miss them. Like we're some journalists from National Geographic on the lookout for the rarest endangered bird species or something. So naturally, we ourselves as humans, we need to take some breaks from dealing with global warming. And add to that that we have other things to do, other things to worry about than just global warming, then that means that the times where our attention on global warming and the moment of phasing coincide are very rare. And if you add to this the inefficiency of the government, quote, my attention span focuses on global warming for a few seconds each day before returning to other matters. A series of government regulations addresses one aspect of climate change extinction while ignoring others, such as runaway fossil fuel consumption. So we have to develop other means to perceive hyperobject and global warming. Software using mathematic formulas are a way to map out global warming. A hyperobject exists for us as a map in a highly dimensional phase space because it is impossible for us to grasp as a whole with our senses. And so indeed, if hyperobjects go by the motto, everything is in everything, well, that must be quite the toll on the senses, right? How can you see everything in everything? That can sound more like metaphysical gymnastics rather than, something realistic. But the problem is, that's why we need philosophical insight that go against the Newtonian common sense we mentioned earlier. Like indeed, traditional logic can present us some limits when it comes to hyperobjects. So being unable to see how a phrase like objects seem to contain more than themselves can be anything else but sheer absurdity, for example, that requires that we venture into some dark territories about logic. So the kind in which we can see how things are just connected through their relationships, but are ontologically connected to each other. This means like the biosphere isn't just made of the relationship between animals, rather animals themselves are made of the biosphere. Whatever is part of the biosphere is also part of the birds, the fish, the clouds, the trees, the worms, the snakes, etc. He says, a flock of birds on a lake is a unique entity, yet it is also part of a series of hyperobjects, the biosphere, evolution, global warming, etc. This interconnectedness isn't just accidental, but is inherent in the being of the biosphere. And so failing to see it is also why we fail at seeing global warming, because we don't think that there is any ontological link between its phases, just like we don't think that there are between the phases of the biosphere. The birds are like phases of the biosphere, and if we don't see the real nature of their relationship to other beings, then we also fail to see the nature of global warming. And so we need to acknowledge the rift, the abyss between the bird and the hyperobject, of which it is part and whole. Like beings are both themselves, they're entities, they are entities in themselves. The bird is a bird, but at the same time, they are not themselves because they carry within their being the potentiality for every other thing in the biosphere, including the biosphere. To quote Morton, but an object is and is not itself at the same time, because it has parts that cannot be wholly subsumed into it. Indeed, since objects are inherently inconsistent, an abyss opens up simply because of the rift, the fact that an object can interact with itself because it is a spacing and a timing, not a given objectified entity. So the fact that objects are inconsistent, meaning that they don't have a continuity with themselves, but also with other beings, allows for the coexistence of all of these things. To quote again, the abyss does not underlie things, but rather allows things to coexist. It is the non-spatial betweenness of things. Whenever I put my hand into the toaster oven, I am thrusting part of my body into an abyss. And so this is what gets us to the fifth and last characteristic of the hyperobject, which is interobjectivity. So hyperobjects, they remind us that everything is connected to everything. Like we seen with birds, they're connected to, well, everything. We too can come to that realization through viscosity, for example, that we are connected to everything. And this interobjectivity can also be can be very disturbing because it occurs within the abyss mentioned before. The abyss that allows things to coexist, and that's pretty scary because it's always in front of us. Right? Quote, the abyss in front of things is interobjective. It floats among objects between them between them, though this between is not in space-time, it is space-time. So floats means that the abyss is right in front of you. Like when you look at things, for example, you kind of see a swarm of undetermined possibilities. You are like that Captain Kidd from the anime One Piece, who sees all of those objects and he can control them, giving them any shape that he wants. Except that here the objects too have that power. They can snatch onto you and transform you. And so you don't know what shape you will take or what you'll become, and it's like you're a piece of Legos standing in front of a plethora of all different constructions that you can become. You can be assimilate to all kinds of arrangements, and that can make you feel pretty small and pretty insignificant. And so interobjectivity blurs the line between you and the non-humans. It is very different from, let's say, intersubjectivity, where different people share each other's subjectivity. That's less scary than interobjectivity because, well, at least intersubjectivity has some familiarity to it, right? We kind of feel at home when we are, when we as subjects are connected to other subjects. You know, we feel safe when we are connected to other subjects. But what if we're connected to things that are radically different from us? Doesn't it say something terrifying about our being? That it has no fixed limits, like it can be connected to a machine, for example. Does that mean that the boundary between human and machine, between human and non-human, well, the boundaries aren't that sharp, if they exist at all. I mean, you know. So to quote, intersubjectivity is really human interobjectivity with lines drawn around it to exclude non-humans. So what happens when the non-humans are now included in the connection of intersubjectivity, for example? When according to Morton, we enter what we call the mesh. And so in the mesh, all entities whatsoever are interconnected in an interobjective system that elsewhere I called the mesh. So elsewhere is another book by Morton called Ecological Thought. But in Hyperobjects also he gives a brief summary of what he means by a mesh. A mesh consists of relationships between crisscrossing strands of metal and gaps between the strands. Meshes are potent metaphors for the strange interconnectedness of things, an interconnectedness that does not allow for perfect, lossless transmission of information, but is instead full of gaps and absences. So a mesh isn't like having a continuum of matter. Rather, it is a chain with links and gaps. And so indeed, if there are no gaps between the things in the mesh, then we will fall into monism, right? The idea that basically there is just one thing, you know, and it is a continuum. But that's not how Morton sees reality. It's not one thing, but a bunch of things that each have their own integrity. But that integrity itself has to have gaps in it in order to allow the connection with other beings. And so the mesh that kind of floats in front of them allows them to connect with the rest of objects. You know, them means objects here. So a mesh consists of links and also of gaps between links. These links and gaps are what enable causality to happen. So when the causality happens, when objects connect to each other through the mesh, you can think of it as the linker between things. When you have a translation of objects, like an MP3 player is a translation of music and the material that makes it. But it also extends to your ears, your nervous system, your heart, etc. Like we've seen in Viscosity, it attunes to you to its surroundings, and that attunement is a translation. Like the mesh translate things so that we and them can snatch onto each other. You know, they become appropriate to our beings. And so the entity we call mind or consciousness, for example, is like an MP3 player. It is an enmeshed object as well. And so Morton explains it by describing what is happening when he's typing his text. For example, he describes mind or consciousness as the following. What is called subject and what is called mind just are interobjective effects, emergent properties of relationships between enmeshed objects. Some neurons are wired together in a brain, and the brain sits in the skull of a life form that is sitting at this computer typing these words. Mind is not in the brain, but rather, to use the Heideggerian term, thrown into the interobjective space consisting of a banker's lamp, skull, computer, and keyboard, as well as fingers, neurons, and Mahler's Seventh Symphony playing on iTunes, Michael Tilson Thomas conducting the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, a pair of eyes, a medium-sized wooden Danish dining chair covered with black velvet, the muscular system, and so on. And so this is an example of aesthetic causality. Like the chain of links is the cause, and the consciousness that results of it, it's the effect. What is called consciousness is an aesthetic effect. It is consciousness for. And so consciousness for means basically that this appears as consciousness. It is not consciousness in itself as a disembodied essence. Rather, consciousness is something to be experienced in the same way you would experience a painting. And so there, the interconnectedness of the things in the mesh that results in consciousness isn't due to some logical chain of causality. Remember that determinism is out in object-oriented ontology, but due to an aesthetic chain of causality. Whatever makes you feel conscious is compatible with consciousness, all right? Whatever you experience as consciousness is consciousness. And so just like Morton says in quantum physics, quantum theory is performative too. If it walks and quacks like an electron, it is one. Quantum performativity strongly resembles evolutionary performativity, commonly called satisficing. As a duck, you just have to look and quack enough like a duck to pass on your genes. So there isn't some sort of inherent property that has to make you a duck. You know, if it sounds enough like a duck, then it is a duck. If it appears like a duck without thinking if it is, really a duck or whatever, then it is enough to be a duck. That's aesthetic causality. And it has a huge uncanny feeling to it, something that Morton says forced many philosophers to, one, rigorously separate the causal level from the aesthetic realm, and two, regard the aesthetic realm as a domain of evil. And so we are often too quick at separating the two realms of causality and aesthetics, because when they are intertwined, you basically start creating monsters, like Frankenstein monsters. Frankenstein's monster. When Victor Frankenstein creates his monster by assembling different body parts, that's when the aesthetic enters into the causality. Like the monster isn't supposed to be allowed in the rational world of causality. Nothing should cause such atrocity to exist. It violates everything that is neatly ordered by logic. And so you can find this in reasoning that would be xenophobic, for example. Trans people should not exist because they violate the perfect neat binary between man and woman. That's aesthetic causality. To go back to consciousness, whatever is experienced as consciousness or whatever causes an experience of consciousness, then it is consciousness. Quote, intelligence need not be thought of as having a picture of reality in the mind, but as an interaction between all kinds of entity that is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. So this, of course, would mean that since hyperobjects are basically causing the mesh, being this massive, they create such big rifts between things and their appearances, and that causes us to be interconnected with more objects and in more and more bizarre ways. And so the bigger the rift is, the stranger the combination between things become. And if mind is another one of those combinations, well then our minds are going to get pretty weird. You know, it is not highly likely that the way our minds are is to some extent, perhaps a large extent, influenced by hyperobjects, so that when we think the hyperobjects, we are in some sense thinking the conditions of possibility for the human mind. And so surely hyperobjects are altering our consciousness in the same way, but to a bigger extent than that Marx, for example, argued that ideologies and superstructures do. Like in Marxism, we don't see the ideology, but you can see its effects. And Heidegger had a similar take on the wind, for example. To quote Morton, nothing is ever experienced directly, but only as mediated through other entities in some shared sensual space. We never hear the wind in itself, argues Heidegger, only the wind in the door, the wind in the trees. This means that for every interobjective system, there is at least one entity that is withdrawn. And so ideology itself is not experienced directly, but by entities like the things that you buy, for example, or the organization of space, the social norms and codes, the police, the schools, etc. All of those entities come together and they partake in the hyperobject called ideology. So evolution, for example, is another hyperobject. We don't see evolution, but we can see it through indirect means, like the fossilized footprints of a dinosaur in some mud. To quote, a dinosaur footprint in fossilized mud is not a dinosaur. Rather, the footprint is a trace of the hyperobject evolution that joins me, the dinosaur, and the mud together, along with my intentional act of holding them in my mind. So when we look at a dinosaur fossil or footprint, we are not in the old causality realm anymore. What we have is a sign that points to a phenomenon that is so stretched through time and space that it is literally changing our DNA and bodies, that it cannot be explained with the same old, if there is smoke, then there is fire, right? The old logic of smoke can logically be only the consequence of something burning, therefore there is fire. That kind of logic doesn't work anymore when it comes to hyperobjects, like evolution, for example, or ideology or climate change. That's the kind of thinking that creates disembodied God, all right? When you try to push that thinking of, well, there is smoke, therefore there is fire, so there is cause and effect, well, that kind of thinking, that's when you try to apply it to hyperobjects, to history, for example, where human beings come from, well, that's how you end up with gods. You need a disembodied cause. And so rather, thinking must be, as it really is, according to Morton, causal, but also aesthetics. There has to be a big part of imagination when we see smoke, for example. If we are dealing with a hyperobject, we need a lot of imagination to explain that smoke. Of course, the smoke is caused by fire, but if the fire is a hyperobject, to go from smoke, therefore fire, that's not satisfying anymore. He says, causality and the aesthetic, the realm of signs and significance and sensation, are one and the same. Hyperobjects are so big that they compel us towards this counterintuitive view. Interobjectivity eliminates the difference between cause and sign. And so, in the old way, the sign was the smoke and the cause is the fire. The sign tells us that there is a cause somewhere, and those two are two logically excluding categories. The sign is logically separate from the cause. And so again, that can work for fire and smoke, but not when we're talking about hyperobjects. Like Newtonian physics can work to some extent, but when it comes to galaxies, for example, I mean, that's where relativity is going to be more accurate than a Newtonian physics. And so, to quote Morton, the idea that causality is the machinery in the basement and the aesthetic is the candy on top is now obsolete. As an example, he gives again the city of London, that too is a hyperobject because objects are not reducible to their parts. Then, despite being physical, we have to conclude that hyperobjects are not material. If hyperobjects are the cause of whatever it is we're experiencing, and we said that in their case, cause and sign are basically the same thing, and that signs are not material, they're physical, yes, but physical doesn't necessarily mean material, then we have to conclude that we cannot think of hyperobjects as material causes. Okay, what we have as causes are signs or traces, if you want, things left in memories. We don't have the object itself, we just have a form related to the object. That's what London is, a form, a bunch of signs interconnected. Like the dinosaurs print, London is made of prints of other people, of animals, of bridges, of castles, wars, sports, etc. To put simply, it is made of signs. London, he says, London's history is its form, and form is memory. And so it's kind of ironic because right after Morton says that we have Aristotle to thank for this, because he thought that that the essence of things, their soul, let's say, it's their form, not in the Platonic sense. Plato too thought that the essence is the form, but the form for Plato is transcendental, like it is in another realm, the realm of causality, of course, while matter is, like physical bodies, matter is the realm of aesthetics, and therefore he concludes that matter doesn't exist. And so Aristotle thought, however, that both form and matter are on the same realm. But what's interesting about Aristotle is how he makes these two aspects of the same realm interact with one another. Quote, "We make a weird return to Aristotle, who specified that the form of a thing is its essence and that matter, the material cause, is a perspective trick, a backward glance at the object, quarry, sand, crushed dinosaur bones that were appropriate to form the object in question." So, in other words, in matter, there is the past of the form. Like there is a form, and that form leaves a sign in the form of matter. When you look at a cat, for example, you're seeing something from the past, you know, like the ball of fur that you see that chases mice and purrs is made of matter, but it is a sign of a long process of evolution that's been going on for millions of years and is still happening right now. And so each hair, each square inch of flesh of that cat is a sign for very old forms that we are still evolving. It's like a hard drive, if you want. A surface, to quote, a surface on which data is inscribed. So London is a series of surfaces on which causality has been inscribed. There is no difference between causality and aesthetic appearance. And so this leads Morton to conclude that appearance is the past, while essence is the future. And this is quite a way to say that your existence precedes your essence, right? This is kind of like what Jean-Paul Sartre famously asserted, you know, that existence precedes essence. Like first you are born, and then you have to decide on the meaning of your life. You know, you have to decide on your essence, and so you know, you have to decide who you are. Is not is not now. I mean, it's not now and it's not before, but it is always after. It is always a project, you know, it's always in the future. You always have to decide who you are, but in the future. You are constantly projecting yourself in the future. Your essence is therefore in the future. But it also has a fun twist. Like, if you are your essence and your essence is in the future, then your present is also your future. And so what we see, the material manifestation of that future essence is actually, well, coming from the future. Your essence, or to quote Morton, the attractor radiates temporality from the future into the present. An attractor is the future of hyperobjects. The future lies ontologically underneath the past. So what does this imply? That in our past lies an undermined future. If you had your cat as a kitten, it has the appearance of the past, right? A long process of evolution, but it also has the undeterminacy of that evolution into the future. Like, we don't know what is going to happen to the future generations of cats, you know, like what is going to happen, what cats are going to be in like thousands of years or millions of years. But it's the same thing with global warming. We don't know what is going to happen to the future generations with global warming. We don't know what the cat will look like in another million years. We just know, according to Morton, that the essence in the future is drawing the cat towards it. And so Morton concludes, and with an even more he arrives at an even more radical conclusion, that is, we shouldn't do ecology with nature. Like, when you want to do ecology, you have to remove the very concept of nature from it. But we also need ecology without matter and without the present, because he thinks those concepts are obsolete when it comes to ecology. He says, what we need then is not ecology without nature, for which I have argued. We also need, as I shall argue later in this study, ecology without matter. And just to cap it all, we need ecology without the present. The reason why he believes this is because ecological thought, as it is now, you have the alarmist environmentalist views about the apocalyptic scenario coming up. Those are basically urging us to act now. And if right now, as if right now there is nature, as if there is matter, or as if there is a present at all, you know. He says the cynical ideological distance of typical of modernity, is maintained by these injunctions to act, which include the guilt that cripples genuine action, which of course includes reflection and art. But more important for our purposes, hyperobjects themselves prevent us from being presentists. But none of that mentality of the acting now has ever helped ecology, as he argues. We've only been acting now for quite a long time, and things have only gotten worse in terms of global warming. We can say that it is some sort of idealism for Morton, the belief that if we act now, then global warming, which is something that is too far stretched in time, like thousands of years, more to come of it, and we probably won't even see the end of it. If we act now, well, then global warming will, I don't know, go away or something. Now, how can it go away if there is no nature, no matter, and no present, right? He says, what we have instead is a non-spatial rift between past and future that corresponds to the rift between appearance and essence. Between these two fundamental forces, the present is nowhere. Objects are never present. And so we too aren't present, since we too are objects. And so this is what hyperobjects bring us to realize, that we have to live in a reality in which we don't exist. And so Morton says that this is the point of ecology. Ecological thought should focus on making us cope with the fact that we don't exist, like we're ghosts trapped between past and future, and that we will never see that future. We don't even exist in that future. And so, to quote, the very large finitude of hyperobjects forces humans to coexist with a strange future, a future without us. And for us, that is the end of the world. A future without us, a world without human beings, is what for human beings the end of the world. There is no teleological metaphysics or religious purpose that is going to take you out of this mess. And that's how Morton ends his first part of the book. So next time we will look at the second part, which is the end of the world, which is like what happens to our world when we get there, when we get to the end of the world, or when we already getting there. So that's it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time, probably next week, for the second part and the final part of Hyperobjects, Timothy Morton's books.